We are very excited that the lecture hall is filling up nicely tonight. Good evening, everyone. I'm excited to welcome you tonight to tonight's guest lecture by Colin Curley from Field Operations, and the lecture is entitled Producing Biophilia. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mona El-Kafif, a professor and the graduate director for urban design at the School of Architecture. This lecture is co-sponsored by the UVA Urban Design Certificate Program and also the Urban Design Academic Council. And before we start the evening, I wanted to just drop a couple of lines about this. The UDAC Steering Committee, and I'm really happy to be one of the founding members, launched a virtual lecture series, and we are extremely thrilled to have Colin with us today to start the series. And the series is also shared among other programs in the US and currently streamed for this purpose. The UDAC's mission is to support academics, educators, and professionals to strengthen the field of architecture from our multiple, from the field of urban design, from the multiple disciplines that are contributing to this. So having Colin today with us with dual degree is a really fantastic opportunity. So in this context, I'm truly honored to welcome Colin Curley, a valued colleague, alumnus, and also a friend. We are really happy to have you back to the halls. And tonight's evening is moderated by a group of students in my seminar. So I want to welcome also Matthias and Catherine, Stanley, and Gordon, who will moderate the evening today. And I'm handing over the microphone to Matthias, who is going to introduce Colin to all of you. Thank you.
Welcome, students, staff, and virtual attendees on this gorgeous fall evening to tonight's lecture with Colin Curley. As students participating in the Urban Strategies course this fall, taught by Professor Mona El-Kafif, we would like to thank her and the UDAC for bringing Colin Curley back to grounds and opening this lecture to the broader community. And thank you, as always, to the Campbell Hall support staff for helping put this lecture together. Now to introduce tonight's invited lecturer, Colin Curley. He is a landscape and architectural designer who works as a senior associate at Field Operations in New York City. At Field Operations, he is currently leading a large interdisciplinary team in the design of Sojourner Truth State Park on the banks of the Hudson River in New York. That includes the first ever buildings for which Field Operations is the design architect. Very cool. Before his time in New York, Colin earned his Bachelor of Science in Architecture from the University of Virginia, Wahoo, and his Master of Architecture and Master of Landscape Architecture from the University of Pennsylvania. Colin's notable post-grad efforts in academia include teaching graduate level landscape architecture studios at UPenn, and he served on design juries at both his alma maters, Parsons School of Design and Cornell University. He also manages a research, graphic design, and production journal label called LA Plus, Interdisciplinary Journal of Landscape Architecture, which you should all check out. It's fantastic. And so at the conclusion of this lecture, please stick around for our panel discussion moderated by students from the class and to ask your own questions. And I think we're all very excited to hear Colin Curley's lecture, so please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much. It really is a pleasure to be back here. Lots of core memories being unlocked, being back here in 153. As Matthias mentioned, I'm a senior associate at Field Operations in New York. So a little bit about us. This slide says 100. We're probably closer to around 80 designers from around the world, and we are a very interdisciplinary practice. We also are majority women in our office, as well as the majority of our office is from outside the mainland United States. So a lot of diversity of perspective that really is brought to our work as we work both domestically and abroad. This is our partnership team. And so as you can see here, also 2/3 of our senior leadership are also women. We believe and we kind of operate under the statement here that great public spaces define great cities. And we really look to calibrate all of our designs to the unique characteristics of each place. We root our designs in analysis, sustainable principles, and really look to lead by design through innovating in every project, all sorts of different types of projects, including development frameworks as well as built work, and really seek to innovate through formal expression, program, craft, and ecological function. What I love about landscape and what I really enjoy working at field operations is how interdisciplinary this really is as a field. And I can state confidently that in my time at field operations, I've touched every single one of these bubbles. And I think that these bubbles also, in this kind of more broadly interdisciplinary set of thinking, is important to consider given the subject of tonight's discussion on biophilia. I looked up the dictionary definition of biophilia. So here it's saying that it's a hypothetical human tendency to interact or be closely associated with other forms of life in nature, a desire or tendency to commune with nature. I really don't like this definition for two big reasons. The first is the idea that humans as a species are distinct from nature. This is an image from the LA Plus identity issue called The Molecular Man, looking at the kind of Vitruvian man as sort of the Where's Waldo here, and looking at the percent molecular composition of a human being relative to the molecular composition of the Earth's crust. In addition, what the COVID pandemic sort of showed us was that in many instances, species other than humans were more than happy to occupy our environments as soon as we left. So I think it's important to realize and to consider that it's humans who have spent our existence insulating and isolating ourselves from our environment. We're the ones that drew the distinction and established this binary. Which leads me to my second issue with the dictionary definition, the underlying premise that there's a clear distinction between the presence of nature and the condition of its absence. This is an image of the Dutch Kills branch of the Newtown Creek, which is a federal Superfund site in New York that I took from a canoe about 8 years ago. Nothing is natural in this image. It's what Antoine Picon would term an anxious landscape, and that it makes us feel anxious because we can't tell where pollution and toxicity end and where resilient natural systems begin. And yet we can see someone's built a deck and pulled out some patio furniture to create a place of respite within this hypertoxic landscape. By contrast, here's an image of a grid of images from the Great Salt Lake that includes conditions and features that are natural, as well as a work of iconic land art and traces of human interventions. But which is which? This is the kind of nature that really doesn't get much love. And as Gretchen Henderson wrote in her LA Plus piece on this landscape, nobody really cares about microbes. So I went to the Biophilic Cities Network website and I found this statement. And what interests me is the last part in green here, the idea that environments are shared habitat for non-human life and people. So rather than think of biophilia as some kind of hypothetical tendency or attempt to bridge an imagined binary, I think it's more interesting and productive to proceed with this concept of a shared habitat or a shared environment. And if we think about cities as shared environments, we can move beyond putting green lipstick on a concrete pig. We can think, as many urban ecologists do, about environments as structured sets of interactions between biotic and abiotic matter across physical and temporal scales, between material and cultural elements that are constantly in flux. Through the lens of urban ecology, one will see environments described as dynamic, metabolic, nonlinear, adaptive, and self-organizing. In LA Plus Beauty, philosopher Maria Grazia Portera contributed a piece in which she discussed aesthetic niche theory and its implications for the environment. In a nutshell, all species shape their environments in a way that suits their needs and desires, or form their niche, and in turn, their environments shape them as well. As she wrote, humans are the most powerful of the niche constructing species. because through our modifications of the environment to suit our needs and desires, including aesthetic ones, we've thrown an entire planet out of balance. And so you can see in these images taken from my office last summer, wildfires in Canada impacting air quality in New York. So it's clear that our global environment's inexorably linked, and the attempt to distinguish human environments from nature is futile. These are diagrams redrawn from Peter Del Tredici, and they're diagrams that describe vegetation dynamics, but I think that they're actually pretty interesting in terms of shaping how we might think about and consider shared environments. So on the left, the idea of kind of stasis or restoration, that you have a stable environment, something comes in as a form of disturbance that destabilizes the environment, but then action is taken to bring it back to its original state. On the right hand is dynamism and adaptation. The idea that some kind of a disturbance comes in to destabilize an environment, but something new is introduced that reorganizes an environment. And through competition, through time, and through process, the environment is then once again stabilized until again, some other form of disturbance is introduced. And so I think that these disturbances or disruptions that tilt environments out of balance could include zoning or rezoning, as seen here in Greenpoint, with a massive influx of density that impacts transit and overtaxed combined sewer system and therefore water quality, and leading to increased rents and gentrification. This is a neighborhood in which I once lived and no longer do. Another would be urban renewal, redlining, and institutionalized racism, for which there are too many examples, including Vinegar Hill here in Charlottesville, which drastically reshaped environments and led to disparate investment in communities and environmental injustice. We also see a change in energy policy and the evolution of new technologies. This is a project here that I've been working on in Boston. That's the redevelopment of the Edison coal power plant in South Boston into a mixed-use development. And we also see natural disasters such as hurricanes that occur with greater strength and frequency as a result of climate change. In some places like New York, this prompts reorganization and adaptation, but in others, little is likely to happen. And indeed, nearly half our country is poised imminently to vote for politicians who continue to deny the existence of climate change. The fact that and then lastly here, the fact that we've shaped an environment that is not a closed loop. We rely on a placeless and enigmatic elsewhere that is in fact a very real somewhere, what urban ecologists have referred to as ghost or shadow acreage contained within our ecological footprints. And so I think the idea of designing shared environments is really about structuring relationships and understanding design as existing within a much broader social, material, and ecological context. It's also about agency. And so going back to this notion of aesthetic niche theory, while all species shape their niche, we've shaped and continue to shape ours to suit our own interests. And it really hasn't worked out all too well. So this image here is from an installation by an artist named Natalie Jeremijenko, and her provocative installations question non-human agency in the environment, particularly in cities. And this is from a project she's installed a few places called Moth Cinema, where she planted a garden and shined a light into it to attract moths to shape a hot new moth hangout. The moths then bounce around and travel from plant to plant. And the light also projects shadows onto the screen, so the moth's dance is expressed and introduced into the environment. Non-human agency was also the prompt for the LA Plus Creature Design Competition, where designers were asked to choose a non-human creature as a client, identify its needs, design or redesign a place, structure, thing, or process to improve your client's life in a way that also increases awareness of and empathy toward your client's existence. So these images here are from the Editor's Choice winner, Sophie Panzer, who designed an optimized environment for paper silverfish to breed and feast as their food source is disappearing, given that libraries and archives are becoming more digitized. And so here, the idea that the wallpaper that lines this abandoned water tower would slowly be consumed by silverfish over time. So what I'd like to do is take 3 field operations projects that I think address this notion of designing a shared environment in organizing or reorganizing to adapt following disturbance and to consider non-human agency. The first here in 2001, there was a major earthquake in Seattle, the Nisqually earthquake. And as a result of the earthquake, Seattle saw some pretty serious damage. You can see a section here through the Alaskan Way Viaduct that was a highway that took cars along the Seattle waterfront, and it was no longer safe given the structural damage from the earthquake. In addition, gribbles, little insects, had been eating away at the timber seawall, and so together this made Seattle really vulnerable in terms of the city and major utilities potentially washing away into Elliott Bay. So what this actually really set up was a pretty incredible opportunity for Seattle to reimagine its connection to its waterfront through the removal of this viaduct that cut it off. And this is a diagram here of all of the different interest groups that were involved with the project. So if it wasn't clear already that cities are ecosystems, I think this really kind of brings that point home. And so the project really became about trying to use this as an opportunity to reorient Seattle towards Elliott Bay. And a project of this scale and magnitude is actually made up of a series of projects. I should say we started this project in 2010, and it's now finishing construction. So this first project was the construction of the Elliott Bay seawall itself. And so looking at Seattle in the context of its, in kind of a broader ecological context, Elliott Bay is a very significant portion of a salmon migration route and salmon run. And so salmon had seen degradation of their habitat over time, and it was interrupting their ability to migrate and breed. And so their populations had been declining. So the idea was, how could we also, in addressing this project, address the needs of salmon? And so what salmon need in order to run is high light levels in shallow water. But that's not the condition along much of Elliott Bay. So you can see here in this illustration, you have a seawall, a very narrow corridor up against the seawall, and then piers that cast shadows, force the salmon into deeper water where they're subject to predation, and therefore, of course, their populations had been declining. So working with a very broad group of collaborators, we worked to design a seawall and system here that could recast the Seattle waterfront as a migration corridor for salmon. The first piece here is this habitat beach as kind of the entrance of the corridor that increases habitat and foraging area for the salmon. And then here, the design of the full waterfront section, looking at pulling back the seawall to give space back to the bay, designing a seawall with a light penetrating surface, and then also looking at an upland design that helps to filter stormwater and rainwater before it re-enters Elliott Bay. So these are the components of the seawall, the light penetrating surface at the top, the Z panel that's kind of a superstructure to support everything, the textured face panel, these habitat shelves along it that are designed to be able to create opportunities for kelp to grow so that salmon have a food source as they're running. And then a marine mattress at the bottom to reduce the depth of the water because, again, it's light and water depth that salmon need. So this is what the existing section was of the waterfront. And then you can see here the proposed section. So you have the textured seawall, the Z panel, and the habitat bench. Going element by element, this is one of the textured seawall panels. This is one that we designed here. And you can see here, prior to the demolition of the viaduct, the installation of the new seawall. These are the panels being lifted into place. You can see them here along the edge. The next element to come in was the habitat bench. And so what it is this mattress kind of filled with rock that is produced as these modular units that were then lowered into place along the seawall. And then you get into the structure of the promenade itself. And so the solution here in terms of meeting different conditions along the pier and to be able to support that light penetrating surface was this sort of Z panel superstructure. And then the light penetrating surface panels came in on top of that. An edge beam is constructed, and then there's space left for a movement joint between the panels and the pier in terms of, again, considering the vulnerability for seismic events in Seattle. And then the light penetrating surface panels themselves. You can see here, this is a rendering of trying to study the light actually making its way through the light penetrating surface to give the salmon some light along their journey. And in looking at this, we studied a number of different shapes, sizes, and orientations of the actual glass blocks within the panels. And you can see by far and away that 12 by 5 rectangle on the right-hand side in that particular orientation got us the highest light levels. So here, another comparative rendering of the different panel options. Here you can see those panels being produced. They were all precast panels. You can see all the reinforcement and the knockouts there for the glass blocks. And here, contractors lowering them into place onto that Z superstructure. And then this I kind of love as a rendering. This is the full system, the full construction before the water was let back in. And you can see really just how bright that is as a space. And this is after the water was let back in and the kelp began to grow along those shelves, again, providing a food source for salmon. And what was really exciting was that really almost as soon as it was opened, the salmon came back. And they are happily swimming along the seawall today. The second project, given that the viaduct had been demolished, the cars needed to go somewhere. So this is the tunnel that was bored to route traffic underground. There was a specialized piece of equipment that was built to do this. Her name was Bertha. She got stuck, and so the construction got delayed for a little bit, but it's complete now. And then you can see here the viaduct prior to demolition, the viaduct here being taken down. And then just really the difference before there's any expanded public realm constructed in terms of how the city then is meeting the waterfront. The third project is the new surface street to replace the Alaskan Way Viaduct. So you have Alaskan Way and Elliott Way, and then the waterfront public realm. So the public realm really was, again, this opportunity to reconnect Seattle and its neighborhoods down to the waterfront. And looking at how each one of these kind of neighborhoods might land and create sort of a distinct zone along the waterfront. Here you can see the idea of the different programming along the waterfront, thinking about it not just as the segments, but as a continuous whole. Over on the left, that kind of gradient green there is that habitat beach that initiates the salmon run. There were a couple of piers that were part of this project as well, Pier 58 and Pier 62, 63. You can see here the before image of the Alaskan Way Viaduct and then the full design of the new public realm. As I mentioned, it's under construction. It's nearing completion. This is a portion of the cycle track and planting from, I think, a year or two ago. And significantly, kind of at the northern end is this Project Overlook Walk. It just opened a couple of weeks ago. And there's a substantial grade change from downtown Seattle to the waterfront. And so this is basically a bridge to connect the Pike Place market front down to, you can see the label there, the Seattle Ocean Pavilion, which is an expansion of the Seattle Aquarium, and down to the waterfront. So public market, I think if you think of Seattle, you think of this image. And then here, the before public market is kind of that long linear brown building up on the left there. So you can track that through to this image here. Not quite complete, but you can see Overlook Walk, Pier 62, 63 in the foreground, and the new Ocean Pavilion. Some photos from opening day, and really this being a space about, again, facilitating that grade change, but also really celebrating a reconnection of Seattle to its waterfront. So you can see here the views of the Seattle Eye all the way down to the port. This is the portion of the Overlook Walk extending over the New Alaskan Way. This, again, that kind of ramp leading down, but to the left, also thinking about ways in which grade change could be playful. Here, this is on top of the Ocean Pavilion, seating steps with a really commanding view of the Seattle Eye there. But again, really orienting the space and orienting views out to the bay. And so if you think about what this was before in terms of the Alaskan Way Viaduct, cars would occupy this space, and now it's a space for people. So it's just a really amazing kind of view. You know, we're lucky that that's, you know, what you look at. So here you can see, just in terms of understanding the section and the levels a little bit, there's sort of a landing that's at the level of Alaskan Way. And then you can see what are called the Salish Steps to the left-hand side there that descend down to the waterfront. This is seated on the Salish Steps towards the bottom, and then looking back up at the full Overlook Walk back to the city, and then down from Pier 62, that Ocean Pavilion and the skyline. One of the interesting features of the Ocean Pavilion, which we did not design, but we collaborated with the architects, is this oculus. So along the waterfront, you can pass underneath and see the aquatic life above you, which is fun because about 13 years prior, we produced this rendering, which was an idea of activating the underside of Overlook Walk with a shark tank. So just, you know, there's no bad ideas. Then moving to the East Coast, thinking about sort of that kind of ghost acreage or placeless elsewhere. This is the last garbage barge headed to Fresh Kills. It departed March 22nd, 2001. And Fresh Kills, as a landfill, opened in 1948. It was originally intended to be temporary, but had become the largest landfill in the world by 1955, a designation that it maintained until its closure in 2001. It did reopen temporarily in 2001 to accept rubble from the World Trade Center after 9/11, and about a third of the rubble from 9/11 came to Fresh Kills and was sorted for personal effects. You can see here in the context of New York City, the size of Fresh Kills out on Staten Island. And this is kind of the existing conditions map here. So you can see all the different landfill units, as well as all of the Department of Sanitation operations infrastructure that were all part of what needed to be taken into account in designing this landscape. It is 2,200 acres, or about 3.4 square miles. And so this was really about trying to think about how a landfill could be capped and how a landfill could become both meaningful public open space, but also something that is ecologically beneficial and productive. You can see here Fresh Kills in the context of other open spaces in Staten Island. And the fact that Staten Island generally is very flat, there's a lot of beaches. And so what Fresh Kills actually does is create an elevated perspective that is really kind of not afforded elsewhere because of the nature of having built up so much garbage over time. It's really important to understand in terms of how we approach the design, what the actual makeup and mechanics are of a landfill cap. So you can see the waste, soil barrier layer, the gas vent layer. Then there's a drainage layer to manage leachate. You then want to then create another protective barrier on top of that. And then you only get 6 inches of planting soil, which is not a whole lot to do much of anything. And then you can see that piece of equipment there is a landfill gas control collection device. So as the garbage decomposes, it releases methane. And so these are needed in order to be able to manage that off-gassing as the garbage decomposes. This is an image of one of those landfill gas management devices. So obviously this is a site that had a lot of constraints. One being the scale, another being the soils. It's very dry, given the slopes and the lack of soil medium. Also then, as a result, very high ground temperature. There's a concern about the erosion of steep slopes. Obviously, given that it's a landfill, you want to pack as much stuff in as possible. So you want the slope to be as steep as possible if you're trying to create a landfill. There's also then the notion of invasive species and trying to kind of hedge against this landscape being completely taken over. Given that it is a landfill and the garbage is decomposing, you also have to take into consideration the uneven settlement, ongoing monitoring in terms of managing leachate and methane gas, access, and then of course, given the scale of this project, cost. So in terms of the approach, the idea was to really keep it elemental. It's not going to be anything fussy. Keep it big, really, and lean into the fact that this is a very large, vast landscape. And work within the operational constraints and routines of the site. This is something that is the construction of this being an ongoing process as each one of these operational units is closing. So it's still, taking garbage and it's still actively being capped. We wanted to make the processes of restoration and experimentation visible in such a way that we would create healthy ecosystems, really kind of extraordinary and uncanny landscapes that incorporate wild settings for recreation. And over time to think about building a mix of event and art spaces and concentrate them together in the center of the site. These are the layers of what I think our competition entry was the Fresh Kills Lifescape. So you can see starting at the bottom, the wetlands that existed prior to any fill, 150 million tons of waste. Then the liquid the liquid leachate collection and containment, the gas extraction network, the impermeable liner that then goes on top of that, the surface water management and existing roads, because you need to continue to access this, cover soil and vegetation that then together shape new habitats. We create new pathways for circulation and introduce new programs. This is the kind of overall vision of the different habitat types in terms of trying to increase the amount of biodiversity within what would otherwise just be taken over by invasive species. And thinking also not only about the technical constraints, but also how this habitat is organized in terms of its connectivity to adjacent open spaces and natural resources in terms of kind of this overall biomass and being able to enable species movement and again, that connectivity. So it's obviously not something that's all going to get planted and installed at the same time. So this was really about creating and setting in motion a process of recolonization of these mounds. This is the cap being installed here in terms of actually closing up the landfill. And looking at phasing, thinking about, again, cost as a serious constraint, how a phase 1 implementation would be able to stand alone and be productive, assuming phases 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 never happen. So you can see here the idea of tree planting areas that need to be coordinated with the surface access roads, with that gas extraction network, with the leachate management systems, and the very steep slopes as being areas that we wouldn't plant trees. But the idea was that this, I believe it's 20 acres, would be able to stand alone and be ecologically productive, even if nothing else were to happen. So zooming in on that, you can see, again, that sort of below grade network, the movement and management of surface water, and the introduction of that tree planting area into that system. In terms of the section, obviously the trees need more soil than the 6 inches that we're generally afforded. So also being strategic about where these trees are planted, and also ensuring that there is enough barrier protection in terms of the roots penetrating the surface of that kind of barrier portion of the cap. There's also drainage swales. And so there's also this idea within this of differential hydrology and wetness of these communities. And so we'll see that in a minute here. So this being the idea that an early stage of planting, you're bringing in very small scale planting material. When you install it smaller, it's able to adapt better and grow over time. And this being the idea 25 years later of that becoming a forest. So this is sort of this overall idea of, if we can do phases 2, 3, 4, that there's a process that's set in motion on each one of these landfill units as they close. And then over time, through management, it ends up creating that kind of ideal mature biomatrix at the end. I mentioned the kind of differential wetness and the hydrology here. It is a section that's going from a landfill down to a wetland. So actually these drainage swales do create opportunities for wetter environments that then are suitable to different species. So really trying to increase biodiversity and habitat opportunities within the park. This is the overall site plan. So you can see all of the different planting types, as well as the introduction of that kind of program at what we're calling the Confluence, being sort of that active programmed center of the park. It's mostly open now. And so this is an image that really gets at that idea of it being big, elemental, and having that amazing horizon. But what I love about this image is the little landfill gas extractor in the foreground. That kind of reminds you that this is, in fact, a landfill. In terms of those wild settings for recreation, kayaking by an active Department of Sanitation facility. But then also really being able to appreciate the wetlands that did exist here prior to the landfill. And some very, specific opportunities for overlooks and places to stop as one kind of works their way through the landscape. Jumping up the river, this is a project that I've been working on for the last 2 years. This is Sojourner Truth State Park. It is a new 500-acre state park. It is the most disturbed site that New York State Parks has ever taken on. When we first visited the site, our permitting consultant commented, "Why are they making this a state park? This does not seem like the kind of landscape that should be a state park." Nevertheless, it's a pretty amazing site. You can see here, it is along the Hudson River. We have about a mile of Hudson River frontage. It's also the Empire State Trail in New York, the kind of statewide trail network, as it routes through Kingston, goes through this site. And so it's both a state park in terms of a regional destination. But the other thing that's interesting about it is that it's not remote. It's not something that's kind of out in the Catskills. It actually needs to serve as well as kind of a local park and a local asset. Zooming in, you can kind of get a sense here of that connectivity to different neighborhoods in Kingston. And it's a really amazing site with very layered histories. Obviously, is very significant in terms of it being a home for indigenous populations. What we learned is that there were 3 different indigenous communities here, and there was no boundary between them. They all kind of had a confluence here, and there was the land was shared. With Dutch settlement, it was actually part of what was called the Kingston Commons, and that was considered to be a communal woodlot and resource for kind of the community. Obviously, the white male community, and then you can see below on the left-hand side clay extraction from the site for brick manufacturing, and on the lower right, ice harvesting as it used to happen in the Hudson River. And there was this kind of co-location of brickyards and ice houses that took place along this stretch of the Hudson River. Extraction and manufacturing were extremely detrimental and impactful to this site. So you can see everything that's in brown are areas where clay was extracted. All the red little buildings there were all brickyards. And initially the site was mined for natural cement. It's at the northern terminus of the Rosendale Formation, which could make natural cement for bricks. But then when Portland cement came along, the particular limestone didn't matter anymore. And that's when the site really got blasted. So you can see really, from the 50s through the late 80s, all of these really substantial quarrying operations. That created a pretty amazing site. So as we started to look at it, as you kind of moved from both in elevation and from west to east, the uplands were kind of the least disturbed parts of the site. We had some mature forest and significant wetlands there. Then we have the Midlands, the operational ground of quarrying and cement manufacturing. You can see the 4 quarry lakes that were formed as a result, and then the footprint of what was the Hudson Cement Company. And then down the lowlands along the river as being home to the former brickyards. It's a site that's in recovery. It's been pretty much fallow since the late 80s. And so it's this really incredible collection of old mature forest, early successional landscapes, and industrial relics. So our approach to the site was this kind of tripartite statement here: to heal it, to reveal it, and to feel it. In terms of healing, to let the site continue to heal and develop, but to also find specific places where we could help it along. To reveal it, we wanted to make sure that we could kind of reveal the intrinsic beauty of this site and bring people to all of the varied landscapes within it, and to feel it. It's a very tactile and materially rich landscape. Kind of going around here, this is to the north, where we have some remnants of the brick making industry, a mule barn and a lone chimney. The ruins around the cement plant here being foundations from old rotary kilns, storage sheds. We also then have this formation, Steep Rocks, which offers these really amazing panoramic views out over the Hudson River, and views also back up towards it. Jumping over to the west side where the West Quarry Lakes are, you can see the 2 lakes here. They're really these kind of amazing hidden oases. Poplar Pool to the north is much smaller, and you can't really access it. But Quarry Lake is the larger of the 2 and also has these kind of large open flat ledges around it. And then we have mature forest and a very large wetland up there. But it's very clear in this site that it was profoundly disturbed, and you have a lot of traces of the industrial operations. There's a lot of areas, as in the lower left, that are kind of these gravel barrens. There's boulders everywhere, there's emergent meadows, and then there's also waste grounds of rock piles of discarded material. And what's really interesting is that all of that that seems like it is not productive became home to a lot of native species, including species that are state species of concern, federally and also federally endangered species. And so in terms of this idea of being surgical, we were really considering our non-human client base. So we did this kind of analysis. There had been some mapping that had been done prior to our involvement that was really helpful, and did this kind of impact analysis. So we knew we didn't want to touch any mature forest. We wanted to be really careful about navigating around wetlands. We also had a number of historic industrial sites, including a few that were eligible for listing on the National Register. And then we also had these extant industrial structures that we wanted to preserve and work around. So through that analysis, we kind of identified these 5 areas of potential intervention that would be able to offer a range of programs, as well as an opportunity for folks to be able to experience the range of landscapes within the site. This is the first kind of pass at a framework, thinking about circulation, potential for overlooks, and locations of park facilities. So as the design evolved, this is going out to bid on Monday for constructions, which is very exciting. The first piece is circulation, thinking about how vehicles enter the park and limiting their footprint. And then also the fact that we have the Empire State Trail that runs through the site. So we have bicycle and pedestrian entrances to the north and south. The 5 focus areas became 4. So we have the Schultz Brickyard, the Commons, Steep Rocks, that area with the really amazing views, and then over to the West Quarry Lakes. And all of these focus areas are connected by a new trail network that we worked incredibly hard to make fully accessible. It was a huge priority for the state that this be accessible to everybody, which is, I'm sure you can imagine, difficult in a site that's characterized by cliffs. But you can also see here that this is an idea of how these loops might be themed, but that there's a lot of opportunity to kind of appreciate all the different varied natures on the site. Before the project came out, New York also released very aggressive climate goals. And so we were sort of given things that we needed to do that the state had no precedent for. So we looked for guidance, and they said, well, you're the first ones to do it. So we were directed to have no fossil fuels in terms of energy to heat or cool or power anything. So we have geothermal heating and cooling for park facilities. We also have PV systems that help to offset the use of electricity for heating and cooling in some seasonal facilities, as well as to offset electric vehicle charging stations that are located in all of our parking lots. And then you can see in green the 2 focused areas of ecological enhancement. Walking through, this is the Commons, the kind of area that's centered on the ruins of the cement plant, and this kind of ridge area up here that runs parallel. And then this is the site plan of the Commons. This is kind of the main entry into the park, and really the heart of the park that is scaled for sort of larger events, working again within the constraints of what was existing. But you can see up here the notion of that meadow. It's cool. And it actually, it forms a threshold between the parking lot and the kind of event ground. But we thought that it could be more. And so we worked with our ecological consultant to develop this strategy to keep sort of the kind of rough fringe. But then towards the center, where we were regrading, to actually introduce some new topsoil to be able to introduce more plants, particularly those with color and interest, and a meadow that could be mowed at the center a couple times a year if desired for things like movie screenings. So some renderings here. That's the arrival threshold as it exists. You can see that event ground, a new restroom building, and an old industrial shed that we're introducing a sawtooth roof with PV panels. There to the left, that shed, and then this area to the east of it being this kind of plug and play flexible zone where community groups could come in, summer camps, bring in play equipment, also potentially a site for markets. Introducing lighting. This is the only space of the park that has lighting and would be able to operate into the evening. That sort of event ground space being able to also function for larger scale events and performance. The remnant ramble up top, really trying to keep it very much as it is, but introduce opportunities for seating for folks to linger. This sort of to the south end here, an old foundation, removing the concrete to create a bosque. The site really is lacking for shade. So introducing that as an element to the southern end. From the commons, you then head out to Steep Rocks, and this was the trail that was very difficult to make accessible. You can see that, but what we did was kind of concentrate our switchback where you would have a really amazing overlook onto Lost Lake on your way to the pinnacle there. So these are some images. What's interesting here too is this is the only place where you can occupy a quarry floor. All the others were taken all the way down as lakes. And so what we're doing at the very end here is cutting into the bedrock to offer an opportunity for folks of all abilities to be able to get up and appreciate the really amazing panoramic view. Jumping over to the west in the Quarry Lakes. As I mentioned, there's the Poplar Lake and Quarry Lake, which has its kind of larger flat open ledges. This is a kind of aerial view of that Quarry Lake, and you can see the ledges that surround it. The big thing that we're doing here is introducing a swimming program through a floating crib pool in the middle of the lake, adding in a swimming pavilion and places for folks to gather. So zooming in on that, you can kind of get a sense of the programmatic opportunities around the lake. But you also see that we have that kind of note there for enhanced forested wetlands. Getting to the lake, you have to go through a wetland. And we're cutting through a berm to be able to get in. And so we were going to be really altering the hydrology of this wetland. So we thought, what can we do to help it? So you can see here that wetland. And so working with our ecological consultant, those of you who went to New York and to Gansevoort, Nick. And they evaluated the existing wetlands. And so these are some views of the wetlands. Ponded areas were really dominated by Phragmites. Other areas did have a mix of high value native material as well as invasive species. And then again, you can sort of see that Phragmites monoculture where there was areas of ponding. So the approach was to kind of say that in the areas of ponding where we have the monoculture, we eradicate everything. Everything in green where there isn't standing water gets a little bit of a more selective approach. So this is the approach for that zone where we do have good high value material, looking at introducing this microtopography to be able to introduce new planting with the idea that the only way to really combat Phragmites is to shade it out. So we're trying to create this forest in order to be able to enhance the ecological productivity and biodiversity of the wetland. On the other side, where we do have the standing water, you can see in section, those hummocks go down and we plant obligate species. This kind of becoming, it's a forested wetland. In reality, it's a swamp, but nobody wants a swamp. So we had to kind of change our terminology there. But you can see here, so just kind of the overall idea that we have species that we want to preserve, species we want to remove, and key species that we want to plant. And so these are kind of the sort of reference ecotypes here, the idea here of that developed canopy with hummocks, and then that kind of forested wetland sort of swamp. So what's kind of cool is then it's not all that dissimilar from fresh kills. It could be a really interesting experience that as you are entering the lake, you are seeing this kind of really an experiment in terms of how we might be able to increase the biodiversity of this wetland. Here, the kind of overall rendering that you can see the floating crib pool and the swimming pavilion down at eye level, the upland kind of gravelly beach and gangway that leads down to that swimming pool. Lastly, the Schultz Brickyard. This is where we have the remnants of the brick making industry. You can see the chimney down below, mule barn up to the top. And so this is really a little bit more of a spare area in terms of our interventions, concentrating everything sort of around the mule barn and providing access down to a cove. This kind of landscape around the mule barn, the attitude towards the mule barn is to stabilize it for future use as a community facility, if and when a partner comes on board. But developing a landscape with a storytelling circle that provides kind of a more intimate counterpart to the larger gathering area at the Commons. This is kind of an overall rendering there. And what you see at the center is a fire pit with a lid on it that we envisioned to be a stage for folks to speak. And the park is Sojourner Truth State Park. And so the idea here is that we're honoring Sojourner's legacy as an orator to invite people to come and share their own stories. You might remember the chimney, and it is not in good shape. And the issue here is that the top of it is open, and so water and snow and ice have been coming down into it for decades. All the brick is spalling, all the mortar is gone. And so what really needs to happen is the chimney needs to be capped. And what you can see is that it's splitting and it's rotating, and the whole structure is failing. But what we also learned is that these guys live inside. These are chimney swifts. They used to live in hollowed out trees from old growth forests. Obviously, that's a habitat that's been declining. They like to be in chimneys and silos, but they're often evicted. And so we really didn't want to tell these guys that they had to go. So we worked with our historic preservation architect and our ecological consultant to design a cap for the chimney that would not allow water in, but would allow chimney swifts in and out. And I think this is maybe one of my favorite construction drawings that I've ever done. And so the idea being that hopefully, if it works, when you come by at sunset, you'll be able to see the chimney swifts emerge in the evening. This is a summary slide that we put together for a community presentation, and I think it's kind of an interesting one in terms of thinking about going back to this idea of a shared environment and all of the different interests that we were balancing within this project. Thinking about preservation, thinking about Sojourner Truth's legacy, thinking about community, thinking about climate, thinking about ecology, and thinking about recreation. So I think hopefully, I feel that the 3FO projects speak to design as adaptation and an embrace of dynamism, more on the right-hand side there. And they also speak to agency, both of non-human clients and of landscapes that we'd like to pretend don't exist. They also address scale. So while each of the projects is large, the design resolution requires attention to detail, detailing of a seawall, working within the constraints of landfill gas extraction infrastructure and monitoring wells, and even the way that one caps a chimney. So the idea here, the title was Producing Biophilia. And so I think I was thinking of it that way because as designers, we really shape, structure, shift, reorganize, and rethink relationships. It's sort of an ongoing process. It's active, and it's not a hypothetical tendency. And so where I think design is the most creative and most impactful is when it thinks across disciplines, scales, and interests, and understands our environment as one that is broadly and at its most basic level shared. Thank you.